What chance does a team of college students, the youngest roster in Olympic history, really have against the Soviet Union? A squad that had outscored opponents 175-44 and taken 5 of the last 6 gold medals. On paper, it wasn't a question. It was a mismatch. And yet, in February 1980, those odds were put to the test in a way no one saw coming. Stay with me, because the answer to how they pulled off the impossible lies in the details that almost nobody talks about today. Picture yourself walking into a building that doesn't look like much from the outside. A big white box, tucked in the snow-covered streets of Lake Placid, more like a college gym than an Olympic arena. Inside, it doesn't seat 50,000. It barely fits 8,500, but every inch of those seats is trembling with restless energy. The rafters drip with frost, but the heat of the crowd feels like fire. Flags hang from railings in uneven rows, some hand-stitched, some bought from gas stations that morning. You see children with painted cheeks wrapped in scarves, old veterans gripping their caps, and families from Minnesota or Boston squeezed shoulder to shoulder with foreign visitors. Every sound bounces off the low ceiling until the whole arena feels like it's vibrating. This doesn't feel like hockey anymore. It feels like something heavier pressed into the space. Because outside that rink, the world is already split in half. East versus West, red versus red, white and blue. The Cold War isn't a headline, it's the way grown adults lock their doors at night and turn on the evening news with their stomachs in knots. The United States and Soviet Union don't just argue, they threaten. They point nuclear weapons at each other. They measure space launches, military drills, everything, like it's a stopwatch. And now, here, inside this barn-like arena, all of that has been dragged onto a sheet of ice. With blades scraping and sticks clashing, the Cold War has been squeezed into 3 periods of hockey. The Soviets walk out like they always do. Stone faces, clean haircuts, gleaming red jerseys. They look less like athletes than parts of a machine, moving together with exact timing, as if an invisible conductor pulls every string. Across the ice, the Americans shuffle awkwardly, almost boyish. A few faces still carry acne scars. When they skate past each other during warm-ups, you catch a flash of the imbalance. One side polished to perfection, drilled by the weight of an empire. The other side a collection of collegians still half suspected of being kids trying on uniforms for a dream. And you need to remember, in those weeks leading up to this very moment, American leadership was arguing about whether to skip the summer Moscow Olympics entirely as protest against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Every newspaper headline carried tension. The White House posture hardened daily. The boycott talk grew louder, offering proof the Cold War had entered every corner of life, even sport. So when families set foot inside this tiny Lake Placid arena, they weren't only bringing hot chocolate or noisemakers, they carried their anxieties about bombs, inflation, soldiers standing watch in Europe. They carried fear of a world that seemed too dangerous to hand to their children. And right there, draped around their shoulders, they carried flags, hoping a victory on ice might tell them everything would be fine. So when you sat down in that building, your legs crammed against the seat in front, your coat tucked under you to stay warm on the thin plastic cushion, you realized the rink wasn't just ice anymore. It was a stage, an unspoken theater where identity and ideology were going to clash. Every pass was going to be more than puck movement. Every collision was going to echo further than the boards. The Cold War was suddenly alive in skates and helmets, wrapped inside a small-town rink that smelled of popcorn, sweat and sharpening stones. The drums of politics outside made the air inside unbearable. People whispered about whether Moscow would answer an American win with some kind of retaliation, even if it was only more propaganda from the newspapers of the East. At the same time, they feared what an American loss would look like. Another symbol of decline, proof that the enemy produced not just rockets and armies, but unbeatable humans crafted by their system. This wasn't just a scoreboard, it was a mirror of confidence. Win, and maybe America still had that spark of greatness. Lose, and the gloom of gas lines and geopolitical stalemates would stretch even darker. Stand there for a second at rinkside. Hear the sound of skates carving into the surface, a staccato rhythm echoing across dim rafters. Posters on the walls reading USA sag slightly in the damp air. Down in the locker rooms below, one side zips their jerseys with quiet conviction, while the other side stares at the floor, knowing history is about to judge them. The crowd begins to chant, voices uneven, sometimes falling out of sync, but building to a roar anyway. Children stand on their seats, stomping along with the beat. Parents lean forward, knuckles white on wooden railings. Even before the first face-off, you know this game already matters more than almost anything else in these Olympics. Maybe more than any other game in sports had mattered in years. Every flick of the wrist, every save, every check along the boards, these things would feel charged with the weight of presidents and premiers, missiles and spies, boycotts and headlines. And the enormity of that reality didn't scare the Soviets. It was oxygen. They believed they carried a system that worked, proof that citizens, molded like chess pieces, could dominate. For the Americans, it was suffocating pressure, balanced against one thin hope, that belief, youth, and unity might somehow cut through. So as the crowd swayed in chants and Soviet eyes locked forward like iron, the stakes stretched far beyond hockey sticks and nets. Symbolism sharpened every edge of the night. Families feared inflation, shortages, hostages in Tehran. While here on the ice, a squad of kids draped in stars and stripes symbolized possibility. The Soviets didn't need words. Their jerseys, their composure, their history screamed order, dominance, result. And this tiny rink now sat like a glowing stage between two clashing world views, set to decide which would shine, at least for one unforgettable night. And here's the thing. You didn't need to understand the intricacies of diplomacy or follow every headline. You just needed to feel your heart pound in rhythm, with the chants around you to recognize this wasn't simply sport. Even before the puck dropped, the game already carried the weight of history. A full nation had unconsciously agreed that the outcome here would echo. It would be held up as proof or failure, reassurance or despair. The spotlight cut sharper than any arena glare had ever done. And stretching across from blue line to blue line stood a squad with names that would become legendary, names that made people shiver before the first whistle, because to understand why beating them seemed impossible, you need to know who exactly the Americans were up against. 3. The Red Machine's reign. How do you beat an opponent who doesn't lose? Think about that for a second. Not one that has a bad day now and then, or one that occasionally plays down to the competition. I mean, how do you measure yourself against a machine that wins, and keeps on winning? That's what the Soviets were in hockey. By 1980, they had built such a record of domination that just standing across the ice from them felt like a mismatch. It wasn't about hoping to win. For most, it was about surviving long enough to say you played them. That's the kind of shadow the Red Machine cast over the sport. For nearly 2 decades, their grip on Olympic hockey was suffocating. Out of the previous 6 tournaments, they'd claimed 5 golds. The one year they slipped, they still finished on the podium. By the late 70s, Soviet hockey meant more than a national team. It meant an entire philosophy engineered into the bloodstream of the sport: fast skating, relentless puck possession, and conditioning that made third periods feel like firsts. If you drew them in a bracket, your hopes were reduced to holding their goal count under double digits. Everyone else was playing for silver. The numbers behind it didn't feel real. Since 1964, they had buried 175 pucks behind their opponents' goalies in Olympic competition, while allowing just 44. That's not balance, that's annihilation. Imagine trying to walk into a game where the average scoreboard already leans 4 or 5 to nothing in their favor. Teams didn't just lose to them, they were dismantled. Fans stopped asking who might threaten them because the answer was nobody. The only lingering mystery was often how much humiliation opponents would absorb on the way out. And inside that juggernaut were players spoken about like folklore. Between the pipes, there was Vladislav Tretiak, the goaltender who was more myth than man. Some called him the Wall, others regarded him as the best goalie alive. He wasn't flashy, but he was impossibly steady. cutting down angles before shooters even lifted their sticks. In front of him, you had flashy forwards like Valery Kharlamov, whose skating looked like poetry, until you realized he was also burying you in goals. Add in Sergei Makarov, a winger with vision sharp enough to cut open defenses by himself, and you start seeing why teams folded before the puck even dropped. On the blue line, there was Vyacheslav Fetisov, mixing muscle and intelligence in equal portions, capable of shutting someone down and starting an attack in the same breath. The captain, Boris Mikhailov, worked as the heartbeat, combining grit with leadership in a way that made the whole system feel inevitable. And that's the key: system. The Soviet team wasn't a collection of stars pulling in different directions. They were the living proof of a program, a factory floor where repetition and loyalty crafted athletes as identically precise as the parts in a Moscow assembly line. Their hockey grew out of their military approach. Players were drafted into central club teams, forced to train in government-controlled programs, skating under the eyes of coaches who doubled as drill sergeants. They practiced the same drills so many times that reactions became muscle memory, choices becoming automatic. But this wasn't cold discipline alone. They blended it with creativity, slick passing sequences, fluid formations, constant movement that left opponents gasping. The Soviet idea was collective brilliance, everybody in sync, no weak links, no selfish plays. That's why opponents sometimes felt they'd already lost before the opening whistle. You strap on your skates, look across the ice, and see 20 men who have trained together every day of their lives, who share not only the same plays, but the same instincts. Then you try to match it with your ragtag national squad that barely knows your line mates outside training camp. The intimidation seeped into everything. By the time the game began, the doubt was already sitting heavy in your lungs, cutting off your energy before the first shift ended. European clubs tried. Canada had tried. The NHL's best had seen flashes of them in exhibitions and come away shaking their heads. Teams would show up prepared to play hockey and leave looking like they'd been given a clinic in puck movement and conditioning. It wasn't uncommon to hear players say that after facing the Soviets, you felt like you hadn't even been in the right league. They had one speed, relentless. You could barely touch the puck before it was stripped, recycled, and turned into another goal. So the question kept hanging: who could beat them? Was it even possible to topple a dynasty built on discipline, creativity, and 2 decades of consistency? Every few years, some roster from the West would claim they'd figured out how to counter the machine, play physical, slow them down, trap their flowing style. But it never worked. The Soviets adjusted on the fly, and usually left their challengers lost in the chaos. It wasn't just hockey superiority they carried, it was psychological warfare. You walked into the rink aware that history was against you. And history felt as heavy as lead. That's what makes the stage in Lake Placid so strange in hindsight. Heading into the 1980 Olympics, every sane mind assumed it was Moscow's gold to lose. The rest of the competition was window dressing, sideshows leading up to a coronation. The aura of inevitability was powerful. When the draw placed the Americans against them in group play, most figured it would end in another lopsided scoreboard and a polite round of applause. The machine would roll on, and the kids in US jerseys would learn what happens when amateurs skate against professionals who might as well be mythological creatures. Here's what made that thought so hard to shake. No one else had managed it. No NHL squad, no international powerhouse, nothing. If seasoned pros carrying the pride of hockey-rich nations couldn't figure them out, how in the world could a group of college kids from Minnesota and Boston and Wisconsin even stay on the same ice? That was the impossible math staring America in the face. Every time you stacked the resumes, the Soviets looked insurmountable. And yet, something about that imbalance planted the seed of a miracle. Thinking back on it, the size of the mountain actually made the climb more bizarre. A generation of hockey fans had watched these names, Tretiak, Kharlamov, Makarov, Fetisov, Mikhailov, become etched as almost untouchable. But sports has a way of surprising you. Sometimes, the unbeatable record creates the stage for the perfect upset. For that particular miracle to happen, though, it would require something equally unlikely on the American side. A roster made not of professionals, but of kids barely old enough to rent cars. Kids who hadn't tasted the grind of the NHL, who were still trading college textbooks for hockey gear. And that's where the story turns. Out of all the ways to answer a machine, America decided to send its youngest team ever. 4. America sends college kids. Disbelief is the only place you can start. A roster put together for the biggest stage in the world that was, in fact, the youngest team in Olympic hockey history. Average age? Just 21. Think about what 21 feels like. Some of them barely old enough to buy a drink, old enough to be in dorms, sitting through midterms, rehearsing speeches in communications class, or driving cars with plates still marked by their college towns. And yet here they were, being asked to skate against the greatest dynasty the sport had ever seen. The contrast was impossible not to notice. While the Soviets sent out men hardened by military discipline and professional seasons measured in years, the Americans were pinning their hopes on amateurs who still carried campus IDs in their wallets. A team not remembered for experience, but for youth itself. Herb Brooks, the head coach, knew exactly what he was doing when he put that team together. He didn't just flip through names or reward seniority. He ran the players through something unusual at the time. A psychological test designed to probe their personalities, their behavior under pressure, their ability to bend without snapping. For Brooks, skill on the ice was just part of the calculation. He needed players who could handle being broken down, who could take the screaming, the endless sprints, the mental games, and still keep pushing forward. He wasn't picking the most impressive resumes. He was picking clay, raw but moldable material that he believed could be shaped into something strong enough to survive. And with that mindset, Brooks turned away older talents and NHL veterans who might have seemed the obvious picks. He wanted kids. He wanted speed. He wanted minds still open enough to absorb his demanding system. The roster he ended up with told its own story. 9 of them came from Minnesota, which to hockey fans in the States is practically a second home rink. 4 more came from Boston University. These kids had battled each other at the college level, worn their regional rivalries like armor, some of them barely on speaking terms after bitter matchups. And yet here they were, thrown together under one flag, asked to shelve those grudges and learn a new language of teamwork. If the Soviet roster looked like an orchestra polished by months of rehearsal, this American squad looked like kids stumbling through their first notes, trying desperately to keep tempo. Imagine being 19 or 20, trading a biology textbook or an economics lecture for an Olympic uniform. You go from cafeteria pizza and overheard dorm gossip to living inside a locker room where each practice decides your fate against the most relentless athletes on earth. That kind of confrontation wasn't just physical, it meant exposing vulnerability. Because at their core, they were amateurs. Some had never played outside their regions, some had never seen professional-level pressure. Throw them into Lake Placid, and the world was there to watch. It was no wonder Brooks wanted to know their psychological edges. Without the toughness to survive the amplified spotlight, everything else would crumble. You have to picture what it must have felt like for them. You're standing in a rink, surrounded by cameras, lights, families wrapped in US colors. All the while, a voice in the back of your head reminds you, you don't have a paycheck from the NHL, you've barely grown into your frame, and the men on the other side of the ice are treated like soldiers of sport. It would be so easy to fold under the scale of it, but Brooks didn't dwell on what they lacked. His plan was to weaponize it. That amateur status, the media treated as weakness, Brooks saw as advantage.
These weren't players weighed down by years of professional systems or swollen egos hardened by contracts. They were quick learners, eager to listen, desperate to prove they belonged.
In their lack of polish, Brooks saw the ability to be conditioned in a way pros would resist. Pros pause and question. Kids obey. They grind through drills until lungs collapse because they fear being cut. Because they want the dream to stay alive. and in his tough, unrelenting style, Brooks had found the perfect test subjects. The contrast between the two countries couldn't be sharper. Where the Soviets enforced conformity through regime control, the Americans were choosing the most unlikely contrast imaginable: unpaid amateurs set against paid soldiers of sport. It wasn't just strategy, it was symbolic. A deliberate framing of freedom and underdogs against discipline and inevitability. Where Moscow leaned on polished national resources, Washington pinned its hopes on children of farmers, mill workers, and small-town college programs. And that juxtaposition made every viewer read the game as something larger than puck battles. If the Soviets represented the grinding order of an empire, the Americans represented flexibility, hope, and the stubborn refusal of youth to roll over. So there they were, the kids staring at Trotyk and Charlamov with the kind of awe only college students can feel when meeting legends. Yet somehow, Brooks had convinced them that awe was fuel. He kept reminding them youth meant speed. Youth meant legs that didn't quit. Youth meant the ability to adapt under pressure. The average age number, 21, wasn't meant to shame them. It was meant to remind them they weren't weighed down. They were light enough to move, fast enough to surprise, willing enough to transform. Think of this scene late at night in a Minnesota dorm. Some of these players crammed into bunk beds just months earlier, dragging their textbooks and hockey bags across frozen parking lots. Now those same kids were skating under the Olympic banner, frightened but burning with adrenaline, pulled together by a coach who dared to see possibility in their inexperience. It's like Brooks had stared at the global stage and decided the most unpredictable weapon wasn't a seasoned veteran, but the hunger of kids too naive to believe they couldn't win. And that gamble only mattered because Brooks was planning to push them past breaking points. He knew their youth gave him leverage, but he still had to shape it, to forge it. Every ounce of raw speed or eagerness still needed discipline, still needed to be sharpened into something tougher than just enthusiasm. The choice to go young was not the finish of the idea. It was the first brushstroke in a larger design, and it placed on Brooks the burden of proving his untested philosophy wouldn't collapse under the Soviet avalanche. By the time the roster was announced, newspapers tilted their heads at the audacity. Critics wondered if the United States had sacrificed any real chance by putting kids in against seasoned giants. But Brooks wasn't interested in doubt, and he wasn't interested in rest. He only saw opportunity, the raw clay in 21-year-old bones that he intended to mold through fire. And he would push and push and push again until their legs felt like iron and their chests could withstand fear itself. That was the only way the improbable story even stood a chance of surviving. And that brings us directly to Brooks himself, the man who didn't just pick kids, but chose to break them down and rebuild every ounce of who they were. Because turning youth into history required more than optimism. It required a coach who believed pain and exhaustion could bloom into resilience. And he was more than willing to test that theory. 5. The coach who pushed too far. The rink is empty, except for the sound of skates slamming back and forth, cutting into ice with the rhythm of exhaustion. You look up at the scoreboard and see nothing but a clock clicking down. No fans, no cheers, just the echo of blades digging into frost and the sharp blast of whistles driving you like cattle. These weren't ordinary practices, they were punishments dressed as preparation. The team called them herbies, suicides up and down the ice until your chest felt like it might rip apart. One whistle, sprint. Another whistle, pivot, back again. It went on longer than it should, long enough that lactic acid burned through legs too young to understand what they were being forced to endure. When the lights hummed overhead in an empty arena and the smell of stale concessions had replaced adrenaline, that's when Brooks made them skate hardest. Herb Brooks wasn't a coach in the normal sense. He wasn't patting backs, handing out praise, or pulling players aside with fatherly advice. He studied like a scientist, barked like a drill sergeant, and dreamed like a prophet. Every move had a reason you didn't see until weeks later. He knew his roster didn't carry the resumes of Soviet soldiers, so he built something just as ironclad: lungs, legs, and the nerve to keep going when quitting felt easier. He merged the precision conditioning of the Red Machine with the birthright of American stubbornness. The alliance wasn't pretty. It broke his players down in public, sometimes humiliating them. But it carved out scar tissue that no Soviet defender could overpower. 61 exhibition games. That was their real training camp. Other teams came together for a handful of warm-ups, maybe a short series to build chemistry. Brooks had them playing all over the place, from tiny rinks to European barns, facing professional clubs stacked with veterans. Each game was another chisel hitting the stone, shaping, refining, demanding adjustments. He clocked their shifts with a stopwatch, cutting them at 40 seconds. No exceptions. Too long on the ice, your legs die, mistakes creep in. 40 seconds became gospel, hammered into their heads until they knew it even in their sleep. Conditioning wasn't some background detail, it was the very architecture of his plan. Practices ran with obsessive timing, players spilling sweat onto rubber mats afterward, dragging sore bodies back onto buses because another game was already waiting in 2 days. He played with their emotions too. Brooks kept distance, never joining them in laughter on the bus, never letting them relax into thinking he was one of them. He left them stewing, angry at him, focusing their frustration on surviving together. He wanted them to hate him so they'd lean on each other. During exhibitions, he'd pull a player after a mistake, bench him without a word, leave him questioning his worth. Then maybe the next game, that same player would be thrown into a higher role, forced to rise or drown. That emotional back and forth wasn't cruelty without reason. It was sharpening resilience. When fear became routine, anxiety stopped controlling you. By the time real stakes appeared, nerves were already beaten out. One night, after a lackluster performance against a team they should have handled, he didn't let them shower. He lined them up at the whistle. Forward, back, skates slapping the ice until the arena was almost empty and the custodians had started packing trash bags. The stands were dark, echoes bouncing off cold concrete rows. But still he blew the whistle again. Some players collapsed forward with hands against knees, gasping for air, pleading for just a pause. Others fell backward onto the ice, staring up at distant rafters, in confusion about what this was supposed to mean. Brooks stood, with arms folded, eyes fixed, daring anyone to quit. The training staff watched, unsure of whether to step in. Eventually, the players realized it wouldn't stop until fatigue was shattered and a new level of endurance was born. That night became part of their DNA. They skated not until they thought they were finished, but until Brooks decided they had gone far beyond finished. It's brutal to imagine. Pain sliding into numbness, sweat freezing against your jersey because the arena is empty and cold. Picture your lungs clawing for oxygen, throat raw, legs wobbling. December ice sessions where your body begs to quit, but all you hear is a whistle commanding you forward again. And the strange truth, every round of punishment backfired on Brooks in the way he wanted. The players hated it, raged against it, cursed his name in the locker room. But inside that collective suffering, something hardened. They learned they could live through it. If they could survive their coach, they could survive anyone. Those hours when their bodies broke became the very steel that carried them through February. Think of what that meant when facing the Soviets. A team conditioned to dominate the third period suddenly had opponents who wouldn't sag. Fresh legs against tired giants. Where most teams broke under mental pressure, these kids already knew how to play through fog, through fear. Every exhibition loss, every extra sprint, every 40-second shift wired their muscles to endure. Brooks wasn't building beauty. He was building survival. And survival was the only way to have a chance against the machine waiting for them in Lake Placid. The punishment practices now read like myth, but in the moment it was just suffering stacked onto suffering. The payoff came later. Months of quiet agony paved the runway for those weeks in 1980. Endurance, thicker than muscle or talent. The body remembers training long after the scoreboard erases the losses. Brooks gave them the ability to look at fear and keep skating anyway. That was his masterpiece, not a playbook, not a strategy on paper, but an inner toughness that rival empires couldn't draft or fund. Still, even the hardest practices couldn't disguise the truth, staring them down. Conditioning forged strength, yes, but games were measured on the scoreboard. And conditioning didn't erase the gap in skill, in experience, in aura. Before they could understand how far they had come, reality delivered a slap sharp enough to dim that building resolve. Because right before the Olympics, standing under the bright lights of Madison Square Garden, those kids were about to be reminded just how cruel the Soviet machine still was. 6. Before the Games, a brutal reality. Imagine skating into Madison Square Garden with the crowd behind you, 8,000 people cheering, flags waving, brass bands echoing through the rafters, the kind of welcome that makes goosebumps rise under your jersey. You step out onto NHL ice in one of the most famous arenas in the world, and for a moment, you feel like maybe, just maybe, you belong there. And then the puck drops. Within minutes, the noise goes flat, the scoreboard mushrooms into a nightmare. By the time the horn blows, you've been torn apart 10-3. That's what happened when the Americans met the Soviets just 3 weeks before the Olympics. One of the worst reminders of how wide the canyon between them really was. There was no fluke about it. This wasn't one of those nights when shots bounce wrong or goalies blink. This was the red machine moving at full throttle, rolling over young legs that hadn't adjusted to the speed. Passes from the Soviets snapped like whiplash, so fast that American sticks barely touched the puck before it was gone. Pressure suffocated shifts into 30-second mistakes that turned into goals. Every line the Americans sent out was cut down. Every defensive attempt left them gasping for breath. The arena that had started loud fell quiet except for Russian cheers and the thud of pucks hitting the back of the net. It would be one thing to lose respectably, maybe 5-2, a narrow reminder of how much work remained. But 10-3 leaves scars. It carved straight into the self-belief those kids had been slowly building during all those endless Herbies. They skated off the ice, red-faced, bodies loose with defeat. For the Soviets, it was confirmation that everything was in order. Another American team handed down a beating. They walked back to their lockers with chuckles, calm, brushing New York City off their shoulders as if they'd just completed another training session. To them, Lake Placid already looked finished before it began. The humiliation also multiplied doubts on the American bench. In the stands, reporters tapped headlines into their notes. Did Herb Brooks overthink the roster? Did he set up kids for a war they couldn't survive? Were there other college programs, other older players who might have competed better? You start hearing those questions in whispers, echoed in the locker room by players who won't admit it to each other, but can't shake the thought. No matter how hard you skate in practice afterward, 10-3 still glows behind your eyes. It becomes a number you can't outrun. And then came a brutal twist of timing. Jack O'Callaghan, one of the rougher, harder-nosed defensemen, took a hit that tore into his knee. It wasn't just an injury, it was subtraction of heart. He had been a piece of sandpaper on a team still too smooth. Losing him in the days leading into the Olympics planted another crack. Players saw him on crutches, strapped up in bandages, and wondered how you compete against men twice your size when one of your best physical defenders is limping in the trainer's room. Brooks knew injuries were part of the game, but inside the team saw the gap between themselves and the Soviets widen inch by inch. Picture being a sophomore or junior in college, sitting in that locker room, the echoes of Madison Square Garden still pounding in your head. The smell of deep-fried concessions, replaced by the antiseptic of medical tape and ointment. You're staring at your teammate's swollen knee. You hear the doubts in the silence. Did our coach make the wrong calculation? Did he underestimate how brutal this battle would be? You lace your skates for another practice, already imagining what defeat on the Olympic stage will feel like, wondering if you've been dragged into something you were never prepared for. It's a question Brooks knew they were asking, but refused to answer. Yet here's the strange ripple. The very blowout that embarrassed them also began to bend the narrative. That night, the Soviets saw only dominance. To them, America looked laughable, no more dangerous than a practice squad. They leaned back into confidence, that bordered on arrogance. Maybe they even carried that swagger into Lake Placid, underestimating the very kids they had humiliated weeks earlier. A machine that prepared for every opponent suddenly marked one as irrelevant. And that miscalculation would prove sharp later. For the Americans, out of defeat came something less obvious. Fuel. O'Callaghan on crutches didn't weaken them. It made the rest of the locker room burn hotter, carry more weight. 10 goals against didn't erase their lungs, their legs, all the punishment Brooks had forced into them. It left them enraged, ashamed, but also determined to face February with teeth bared. You could argue that without being shredded under garden lights, they wouldn't have been angry enough to finish the miracle. They carried that humiliation with them like a scar, and scars, as it turned out, became their armor. It's important to imagine how different the story would sound if they had lost a respectable 4-2. Maybe the Soviets would have stayed alert, kept respectful eyes on the US. Maybe the kids would have tricked themselves into thinking near success was enough, easing into the Olympics soft. But the reality of 10-3 poisoned them. It sat in their chests every time they tightened pads. That shared embarrassment bonded them tighter than any comfortable outcome could ever have done. So when the flames of national hope still demanded they march into the Olympics, the Americans had no illusions. They didn't stride into Lake Placid thinking they were ready. They stumbled in, still bruised, still humiliated, weighed down by doubt. And yet, buried under that weight, a kind of sharp hunger started forming. Hunger not to be seen as a farce, not to walk off home ice as the joke of the games. Hunger to prove that the building collapse in Madison Square Garden was just a step, not an ending. By the time the actual tournament began, something less expected happened. The humiliation had hardened into steel. In the group stages, the kids who had been outclassed started finding form. They tied Sweden, stunned Czechoslovakia, racked up wins against lesser teams, and for the first time, whispers spread. Whispers that maybe those kids weren't easy prey after all. And maybe, just maybe, that 10-3 wreckage had lit the fire they needed for the storm that waited. 7. Cracking the ice in group play. Imagine this. The first game of the Olympic tournament, and everything feels fragile. The Soviets had just embarrassed you weeks earlier, so the bar isn't low, it's buried underground. The opponent is Sweden, not a weak team, not unbeatable either. But in Olympic history, Sweden has a habit of sitting tight in moments that count. As the clock runs down in the third period, the Americans trail, desperation building, crowd noise swallowed by nerves. Brooks takes the goalie off, rolling the dice on a 6-on-5. Empty net behind you, nervous hands on the sticks, and suddenly a rebound chance is buried home. Tie game, final minute, the horn sounds 2-2. A tie doesn't sound like much, but when expectation is 0, a tie feels like survival. It feels like maybe, in the right circumstances, these kids could belong. The story might have ended there. Shrug your shoulders, chalk it up to good fortune, let the tournament continue with predictable results. But on the next game sheet, the name across from America read, Czechoslovakia, a legitimate contender, a heavyweight in European hockey. Everyone assumed the US would skate hard, lose respectably, and fade. Instead, they torched the Czechs 7-3. It wasn't a lucky bounce match. It wasn't fluky goals at the right time. It was a decisive beating at the hands of the youngest roster in the field. Suddenly, the kids from Minnesota and Boston looked different. Legs kept moving, forechecks hunted pucks. Passes clicked tape to tape like they'd been rehearsing secretly for years. By the end, reporters blinked double, triple-checking the box score. America scored 7 goals against a hockey power. It wasn't supposed to happen. And then came the first crack. Just before the period expired, Mark Johnson streaked in, pounced on a rebound no one else saw, and jammed it behind Tretiak. 2-2, the buzzer sounding a half-second after the puck crossed the line. In that instant, the crowd detonated. The Soviets had dominated possession, peppered shots, flexed their muscle, and yet the board said even. That equalizer wasn't just a goal. It was oxygen pumped straight into the lungs of kids about to suffocate. It carried something else, too. a decision that would shock everyone in the sport. Soviet coach Viktor Tikhonov yanked Tretiak, the best goalie in the world, off the ice. It was as if he had unplugged certainty, stripping his team of their steel curtain as punishment for a single late goal. Players on the Soviet bench looked sideways, confused. Imagine being a forward who had always trusted the backstop behind him, suddenly skating shifts, knowing a backup was in net during the most pressurized game of the decade. For the Americans, it was like the first dent on an armored tank. Tretiak's removal whispered something new. Maybe the machine wasn't invincible after all. The second period tested that hope without mercy. The Soviets responded with fury, unleashing a rain of shots on Jim Craig, the American goalie, already carrying the weight of an overworked defense. Puck after puck blistered in, rebounds popped loose, sticks slashed around the crease. Craig flung himself across ice, pads rattling, blocker punching pucks into corners, glove snaring shots that could have broken everything. The crowd lived on every save, screams breaking into gasps each time the Soviets wound up again. Shots tilted, pressure mounted, and yet the scoreboard moved slower than expected. The Americans bent but did not snap. You could feel the Soviets' frustration building, shifts ending with sticks slapped against boards, glances toward their coach who still barked but looked uneasier with every minute. By the end of the second, the Soviets led by 3-2, but something strange had grown inside the building. For all their dominance, Moscow could not shake America free. Memories of Madison Square Garden's 10-3 massacre hung ghost-like, whispering that the blowout should already be underway. Instead, Craig dragged his team through storm after storm until the kids reached the bench with knuckles white but still breathing. That closeness mattered more than anything else. Entering the final period down only 1 against the greatest dynasty in sports was not just survivable, it was intoxicating. Sit yourself in that crowd, and it feels different now. The chants aren't nervous anymore. They're solid, rattling through concrete and steel. Fans who arrived, ready to applaud effort, suddenly believe effort might not be all this is. Every rush up ice feels heavier, like possibility wrapped around skates and sticks. Even Soviet fans in the building shift uneasily, watching shots pile up but not convert. The machine starts to look less like perfection and more like a grinding engine, sputtering under endurance it didn't expect. So when the third period begins, the storyline has changed completely. This isn't a coronation anymore. It's a knife fight under floodlights. The Americans, young legs refusing to slow, chase puck after puck with nothing left to lose. Craig crouches deep, glove twitching, the crowd humming like a live wire above him. The Soviets can sense something slipping. They skate harder, push deeper. But every save, every counter-attack, every heartbeat is met with chanting that pounds at the glass from 8,000 throats. You can almost hear the fissures opening across the red jerseys, the first hints that history might be weakening in real time. By the time the clock ticks down toward its final stretch, the improbable has already flared alive in the corners of the rink. America is still there. Against reason, against memory, against the shadow of a dynasty. In a game that began with fear, that featured the benching of the greatest goalie in the world, that showered Jim Craig in a storm of rubber, the US has carried itself to the edge of something unimaginable. The crowd feels it now. The rink rattles on its own axis. The red machine isn't rolling freely anymore. The gears grind, the rhythm stutters, and the air inside Lake Placid tells you one undeniable truth. The miracle is no longer hypothetical. It's circling, waiting, inches away from erupting in the third period still to come. 9. 10 eternal minutes. The clock showed 10 minutes left, but it didn't feel like 10 minutes. It felt like an entire lifetime waiting to be squeezed through a funnel. Every second dragged, stretched, warped into something larger than itself. You could hear it in the crowd, a nervous buzz that would rise to a scream, drop into a gasp, and then snap back into a chant again. People weren't just watching a hockey game anymore. They were gripping the edges of their seats as if their hands could keep time itself from slipping away. You look up and the scoreboard shows the Soviets still in control, the machine still grinding. But then something happens. Johnson crashes through, finds the puck, and ties it again. A swirl of sound explodes so violently the rafters shake. The crowd barely settles before another shift unfolds. Mike Eruzione, the captain who hadn't scored much in the tournament, skates across the blue line with steady strides. He isn't the superstar. He isn't supposed to carry the weight of impossibility. But in one calm instant, he lashes a shot past the backup goalie who had replaced Tretiak. The net ripples. The arena detonates. 4-3. 10 minutes left, and suddenly the miracle is standing on the doorstep. Now imagine the other half. The Soviets did not vanish when that puck went in. They surged. They didn't panic. They pressed harder. It was wave after wave, scarlet jerseys swarming the American zone. You can picture the way the air must have tightened each time they circled the net, sticks clicking against the puck like hammer strikes. They launched shot after shot, furious in volume, puck movement so fast it dizzying even for fans just watching. Every crack of a slap shot was another heartbeat hammering in the throats of parents, children, anyone who wore red, white and blue inside that building. All eyes drift constantly back toward the scoreboard. 9 minutes, 8 minutes, creeping downward like molasses. Nervous glances bounce between the red LED numbers and the blur of bodies thundering from blue line to blue line. America no longer had to score, they had to survive. That's what made it unbearable, the way every second looked like the beginning of collapse. And then you look down and see Jim Craig. Pads wide, glove snapping, mask angled toward every incoming shot. He had been tested all game, but now he turned into something almost surreal. Each save looked like defiance itself, legs kicking out at impossible angles, blocker jolting aside pucks that seemed destined for the net. The crowd feeds him as much as he feeds them. Every save produces roars so loud they shake the wooden beams above the stands. People slam fists into railings, stomp boots against bleachers, scream each syllable of USA. The chant crashes and falls like waves against ice. By now, fans are no longer sitting. They are standing, arms clutched around each other, like they can physically hold the team upright. Eyes dart wildly, one moment glued to the ice, the next flicking to the seconds melting off the board. 7 minutes, 6 minutes. Each scroll downward is a knife, both terrifying and relieving. Time is moving, but never fast enough. The Soviets keep coming. Their strategy is endless pressure, suffocating shifts that trap the Americans in their zone for entire minutes. Players bend at the knees, sticks trembling from fatigue, clearing the puck a few precious feet just to reset. You watch shifts where American players don't even glance at offense. They dump the puck out and clutch their sides, praying their replacements can endure the onslaught another 30 seconds. Brooks's 40-second rule is no longer theory, it's survival, making sure nobody breaks fully before time runs out. The goalie's mask catches glare from arena lights, beads of sweat tunneling beneath his chin guard. Every crash of Soviet sticks against the boards sounds like doom, yet every blocked shot, every rebound cleared, adds another ounce of belief. 5 minutes. 4 minutes. Crowd now at a pitch that blurs into constant thunder. The announcer's voice cracks through the noise, but quickly drowns again. The Americans can't hear anything except whistles and the blood pounding in their ears. At 3 minutes left, the atmosphere borders on unbearable. The Soviets commit everything forward, even their defense collapsing closer to Craig's crease. American players slump on the bench between shifts, shoulders heaving, eyes wide yet locked on the ice. You'd think fear would swallow them, but in that exhaustion sits focus. They're too tired to overthink. Instinct takes over. Clear the puck, skate hard, hold the line. 2 minutes. Every play becomes magnified. Fans scream for offsides, for penalties, for mercy of any kind. Soviet shooters still line up cannons and fire. Craig gloves one, drops to a knee and freezes. The whistle blows. That single pause buys 15 more seconds. The crowd exhales like survivors surfacing for air. 1 minute. That's when nervous eyes can't look away from the scoreboard anymore. People glance, wince, pray, shout into scarves wrapped over their mouths. The arena is a frenzy collapsing into a primal roar. Every fan in that building is living inside each shift, their throats shredding, their chests pounding. On the ice, players feel it too. The Soviets attack again, but sticks cut passing lanes, bodies drape across shots, desperation replacing skill. Somewhere in there, the belief fully emerges. It's not just possible, it's happening. The final seconds drip down like candle wax. 60,000 heartbeats compressed into one room of 8,000 voices. Crowd noise hits a pitch no decibel monitor can measure. Soviets still circling, still hammering, but the buzzer blares. The game ends. The impossible is no longer rumor. Kids have toppled an empire on ice. The building implodes in sheer chaos, fans weeping, screaming, hugging strangers as if their lives just shifted forever. One line of commentary, carried on airwaves that night, crystallizes the entire event for decades to come. Words that weren't scripted, words that framed the miracle instantly, piercing through all the pounding noise. The moment earns immortality, not because of syntax, but because it captured disbelief turning into truth in real time. Down in the locker room, Herb Brooks doesn't jump, doesn't celebrate in the mob. He closes the door, sits back, and lets silence crack open inside himself. For weeks he had demanded more, cracked their bodies, shredded their confidence, pushed them to points most didn't think they could cross. And now those kids have beaten the team nobody could. Tears roll quietly. He knows what just happened. History tilted, and his kids are the ones holding the lever. And yet the story isn't finished. The scoreboard doesn't hand out gold medals for single miracles. The format demanded one more challenge. The Americans still had to wake up, put skates back on, and beat Finland 2 days later to seal the Olympic championship. 10 eternal minutes had changed the world, but the gold itself still hung just out of reach, waiting in the last forgotten game. 10. The forgotten game, for gold. The miracle didn't win gold. Not yet. That buzzer in Lake Placid didn't crown champions, it only detonated disbelief. Medals weren't handed out for one upset, no matter how seismic. The format demanded another game, and it carried none of the glamour. No empire to topple, no dynasty skulking behind Soviet red. The final hurdle was Finland, a team less mythic but stubborn enough to spoil everything. Imagine being 19 or 21, having the most historic victory of your life in front of millions, only to be told it isn't enough. You still have to wake up in the morning, tape your sticks, and chase 45 more minutes of hockey that actually decides whether the story ends as an immortal triumph or just as a footnote. The setup was cruel in its own way. If the Americans had lost to the Soviets, no one would have blamed them. They'd have been remembered for a spirited fight and still gone home proud. But now expectation was different. They had already slain the giant. Losing to Finland would make the whole miracle feel hollow. Another, almost chapter in Olympic history. The coaches, the media, and the fans knew it. The story couldn't stop with one night. Gold had to be the exclamation point. That meant every ounce of focus had to return instantly, even with adrenaline still lingering from the shock of beating the best. Herb Brooks sensed the danger before the puck ever dropped. This wasn't about X's and O's anymore. He knew the emotional cost of Saturday's miracle might leave his players drained, vulnerable to Finland's hunger. In the locker room before the game, his voice didn't rise with excitement. It rose with warning. Words cut sharp, reminding them that if they stumbled now, history would erase the miracle before it had the chance to harden into legend. His message was blunt: lose this one, and it follows you forever. It wasn't a pep talk, it was a fire set underneath them, a reminder that this gold medal was theirs to either claim or bury. When the game began, the worst nightmare unfolded. Finland struck first, early deficit. 1 goal on the board, the energy in the rink deflating into nervous murmurs. After everything, the buckets of sweat in practice, the humiliation in Madison Square Garden, surviving the Soviet onslaught, the Americans suddenly looked shaky, like kids again, and the possibility hung in the air like a storm cloud. Maybe this fairy tale does collapse here. Maybe Saturday was the peak, and the next day brings the hangover. Think about the nerves leaking through every stride. You just conquered giants, only to find yourself trailing against a team most people barely circled on the schedule. Every second ticks heavier. Stick blades pound the ice in frustration when pucks skip away. Bench players glance at each other with tight mouths, not daring to ask what everyone feels. What if we waste this? What if all of America tuned in, only for us to crumble when gold sat on the line? In those early minutes, the weight of doubt returned, stronger than anyone wanted to admit. Brooks didn't let it linger. His players later remembered the growl in his tone. Play afraid and you'll regret it for the rest of your lives. The desperation translated. Slowly at first, then all at once, composure crept back into their rhythm. They leaned on the conditioning Brooks had forced months earlier. Shifts shortened, legs churned, nerves steadied. They skated not for beauty but for survival, chipping pucks, hammering checks, recentering themselves in the grind. And then cracks began to form in Finland's defense. The tying goal felt less like a highlight and more like a deep inhale, the kind of breath that steadies lungs on the edge of panic. The Americans pulled even, benches erupting with clenched fists, banging helmets. Soon after, another moment, a scramble in front, puck jammed home. 2-1. The ice tilted. For the first time that night, Finland looked like prey. The Miracle Kids, exhausted but ready, pressed forward with energy that surprised even themselves. When the third and fourth goals went in, the roar of release rattled rafters. Suddenly, the scoreboard showed 4-2, clock bleeding down. Victory now, not just something imagined, but something solid. Picture that ending scene. Gloves tossed, sticks scattered, kids embracing each other with tears streaking across flushed faces. The scoreboard didn't just say 4-2, it confirmed that the miracle was no accident, no fluke. Gold medals waited, tangible proof that the youngest team in Olympic history had risen above professionals and written permanent history. In the stands, the flag lifted in slow, deliberate grace, filling the air as players tried and failed to swallow tears. The anthem carried through rafters in voices jagged with pride. Somewhere beyond the arena, phones rang. The president himself called to congratulate them, his voice beaming into a locker room that still smelled of sweat and champagne dreams. That game against Finland isn't the one most people recall when they picture Lake Placid. It's overshadowed, almost forgotten. Next to the miracle that beat the Soviets. But ask any player who skated off the ice that afternoon, gold medal around their neck. A medal couldn't exist without that last push. The Soviet upset was the spark, but Finland was the fire that forged it into permanence. Without it, there is no miracle story, only a legendary upset followed by collapse. By sealing the win, they turned disbelief into dominance, turned hope into hardware. What mattered in that rink wasn't just another scoreboard. It was faces in the crowd, cheeks damp, voices cracking on notes too high for tired throats. It was young men crying into each other's shoulders, knowing they had carried the impossible all the way through. For a nation outside the rink, weary from economic strain, scarred by political hostage crises, and locked in Cold War anxiety, those images punched through gloom like sunlight after storm. They carried more than hockey. They carried a reminder that even in moments of doubt, of humiliation, of impossible odds, something improbable could still break open and lift spirits higher than headlines ever could. Gold secured the underdog story complete. What began as skepticism, tilted into humiliation, bled into training torture, bloomed into defiance, finally crystallized into proof. America's kids stood as champions of the Olympic rink, not paper contenders, not tragic runners-up, champions. And that triumph wasn't contained to Lake Placid. It spilled outward, into living rooms, into headlines, into hearts searching for reasons to believe. It became more than a trophy case entry. It became psychological renewal, a surge of national confidence injected at precisely the moment the country needed it most. And that is where the story widens. Beyond the medals, beyond the numbers, beyond Finland's net. It rippled out into the culture, reminding a fractured nation that grit, youth, and belief could still bend impossibility. The miracle was no longer just on ice. It had crossed into spirit. 11. The shockwaves after the ice. Silence so heavy it felt like gravity. That's what waited inside the Soviet locker room after Lake Placid. Helmets hit the floor. Sticks leaned useless in corners. Players who had been untouchable for nearly 2 decades suddenly stared at skates like they were strangers. Coach Viktor Tikhonov didn't give them comfort. He didn't soften. He raged, pacing like a man betrayed, directing fury at the very players who had built his machine. His only words, cut like cold steel: "This is your loss. Not the government's, not the coaches, not the systems. Yours." The message rang inside their heads like the horn they'd just heard, replaying endlessly in the quiet that followed. The dynasty wasn't dead, not even close. The Soviets went on to win countless more championships, rebuild, and prove in competitions after 1980 that they still dominated the sport. They took gold again in later Olympics. They continued to churn out names that filled rosters, continued their cycle of training soldiers disguised as players. But something else lingered, not in the stats, but in the aura. Before, opponents walked onto the ice already beaten in the mind. After Lake Placid, even though defeats were rare, that intimidation cracked. The armor wasn't seamless anymore. One group of American college kids had exposed gears underneath the machine, shown it was human after all. While the Soviets picked themselves back up to carry on, the ripple in America looked completely different. Morale surged across families, households, entire communities. This wasn't just a sports win, it was a reprieve from the weight people carried daily. At a time of gas lines, hostage crises, and economic gloom, hockey of all things handed a nation a release valve. It felt personal. In schools the morning after, kids wore their own jerseys, taped USA on backpacks, and sketched posters of their new heroes. In taverns and diners, the conversation turned to the boys from Boston and Minnesota instead of inflation and unrest. A hockey score had shifted emotion in a way policies couldn't. For the players themselves, Lake Placid wasn't the end. 13 of them carried those lessons into the NHL, grinding through professional schedules, their faces moving from Olympic highlight reels to trading cards and box scores. Many carved respectable careers, some found only short stints, but all wore the permanent badge of Lake Placid. Every biography, every stat line afterward carried the prefix, member of the Miracle on Ice. For them, every plane they boarded to skate in the league felt different, because once you've toppled giants, the measure of fear shrinks forever. Herb Brooks lingered as a figure just outside their spotlight. He didn't bask in their fame. He stayed coaching, searching, molding. His philosophy, once mocked, was resurrected as genius. The hours he tortured them with, the drills they cursed under fluorescent lights, transformed into mythology. Years later, Lake Placid honored him by renaming the arena rink in his name. A Hall of Fame induction followed, not postured as celebration of one upset, but acknowledgement of a life of envisioning things others dismissed. When he passed unexpectedly in 2003, tributes didn't only recall his record, they highlighted his ability to see possibility in youth. That was the legacy that outlasted even medals. The event itself shifted into something larger than an athletic scoreline. The miracle became cultural myth. Against the odds, underdog glory, resilience against empire. Words repeated in classrooms, documentaries, even political speeches. It wasn't just a hockey tale passed among fans. It became parable. Parents used it as proof for children that dreamers and workers can break through impossible math. Teachers used it to animate lessons on the Cold War, reframing geopolitical standoff into an image an 11-year-old could feel. Psychologists even cited it as a moment when national identity felt buoyed, when gloom cracked open, if just for days, by proof that joy still existed on unlikely ice. Decades later, major polls and networks ranked that night as the greatest sports moment of the 20th century. Not near the top, number one. Ahead of iconic baseball home runs, boxing triumphs, Super Bowls, everything. Because what lived in Lake Placid wasn't about points on a sheet. It was about the intersection of despair and belief, the sudden surge that comes when the collective realizes maybe we aren't done yet. That's why the broadcast footage still circulates, why the grainy clips still shake hands into fists and make eyes damp even for audiences born long after. Remember, this was Cold War America. Fear wasn't abstract. It was lived in the drills at school, in maps showing missile ranges, in nightly newscasts tallying violence abroad. People walked lighter after the miracle, not because hockey solved anything, but because it gave them breathing space. A rare smile in an era headlined by tension. For once, the story wasn't about danger or failure. It was about possibility. The Cold War still pressed on. The conflicts and crises didn't vanish, but for one weekend, a group of college kids carried a fractured nation and gave it permission to celebrate without apology. Symbolism doesn't always have to be searched for. Sometimes it blares through naturally. The miracle on ice wasn't crafted to be allegory. It simply unfolded in a way where every detail carried meaning. Kids instead of professionals, amateurs against soldiers, underdogs against champions, the free against the regimented. No marketing team, no government agency could have scripted it better. It looked like sport, but lived as spirit. That's why when people remember 1980, they often don't mention policy or inflation first. They recall jumping in front of televisions, pounding the carpet, screaming until neighbors knocked. Watching those kids stand against the impossible. The image outlasted the era. So when you step back and picture the rink now, empty, just a quiet building in a snowy town in New York, the echoes make sense. Decades later, visitors walk inside, look up at the rafters and feel something tug at them. It isn't just about remembering a hockey score, it's about remembering that sometimes events come along that carry far more weight than they should. A handful of skaters in their early 20s reached across boundaries and briefly stitched confidence back together for millions. That reminder doesn't age, doesn't dim, doesn't fade with changing generations. The shockwaves stretched far beyond the scoreboard. They lived in Soviet scowls in 1980, in American cheers echoing across suburban streets, in career arcs that sprouted from one February weekend, and in the cultural memory that keeps elevating that night to myth. Each angle comes back to the same truth. This wasn't really about ice. That sheet in Lake Placid was just a stage. The performance was about spirit. What it looks like when doubt is stripped away and raw belief carries people higher than reason should allow. And that's where it still stands. A moment that remains timeless, not locked in Olympic archives, but replayed in hearts and voices when people need to believe again. The miracle has never left. It still glows, decades later, whenever a nation looks for proof that the improbable isn't impossible. 12. Conclusion. What endures from Lake Placid isn't the scoreboard, but the belief carved into memory. A generation saw proof that amateurs could shake the certainty of an empire. Young men, in mismatched college gear, carried the burden of a nation and walked out transformed. If they could turn fear into triumph, what else becomes possible when trust outweighs doubt? That's why the miracle remains more than a sports chapter. It showed how a fractured country could, for one weekend, breathe together. The ice eventually melted, but the reminder it left, of unity born in unexpected places, still lingers quietly, permanent and untouchable.